Ricardo's journey into the shadowy mountains began with an unsettling sense of unease, a feeling that the mountains themselves were watching him. The fog clung to the steep trail like a ghostly shroud, twisting the path ahead into something almost unrecognizable. Every step was accompanied by the sound of gravel crunching underfoot, the only sound in the eerie silence that seemed to devour all life. The trees lining the trail were skeletal, their branches like bony fingers stretching into the mist, and occasionally, a chill breeze would rustle the leaves, whispering in a language Ricardo could not understand. As the day faded into a dim twilight, Ricardo finally caught sight of the inn. It stood at the edge of a cliff, looming against the sky like a forgotten relic. The structure was old, its wood darkened by years of harsh weather, and the windows were cracked, reflecting the dying light in a distorted, almost mocking way. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw a face in one of the windows, a pale silhouette that vanished the instant he blinked. Ricardo's stomach twisted, but he dismissed it as fatigue playing tricks on his mind. The air around the inn was thick, oppressive, as if the place had its own presence, pushing down on him with a weight that was difficult to ignore. When he approached the entrance, the door creaked open on its own, a long, drawn-out groan that echoed in the stillness. Ricardo hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but he forced himself forward, telling himself that he was just being paranoid. Inside, the air was cold, much colder than it should have been, and carried a scent of damp rot mixed with something sickly sweet, like decaying flowers left too long in a vase. The lobby was dimly lit by a few flickering lamps, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Ricardo's eyes were drawn to the pictures hanging there, old, sepia-toned photographs of previous guests. Their expressions were eerily blank, as though they had been caught at the precise moment they realized they were trapped. A shiver ran down his spine as he studied one of the faces. It looked almost familiar, like someone he had seen in a dream long ago. He tore his eyes away, a feeling of dread settling deep in his chest. He stepped further into the inn, his footsteps muffled by the thick, tattered carpet beneath him. As he approached the reception desk, something caught his eye, an object resting on the counter. It was a small, old-fashioned toy, a wooden yo-yo. Ricardo's heart skipped a beat. It was identical to the one he had lost as a child, a memory that brought back a flood of emotions, loneliness, fear, and a night spent crying in the dark, wondering if he'd ever find it again. He picked up the yo-yo, his fingers trembling slightly, and as he did, he heard it, a faint giggle echoing down the hallway behind him, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Ricardo turned abruptly, his eyes scanning the shadows, but there was no one there. The hallway stretched out before him, impossibly long, and he could barely see the end of it. The lights flickered, and for just a moment, he saw shapes moving in the darkness, figures too vague to make out, yet undeniably real. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It was as if the inn itself was aware of him, examining him, deciding if he was worth keeping. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blew through the lobby, extinguishing the lamps, plunging him into darkness. Ricardo's pulse quickened, and he fumbled for his flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing the hallway again, empty, but somehow different, as though the walls had shifted, closing in on him. He heard the creak of a door opening somewhere in the distance, followed by a faint whisper that seemed to call his name. Ricardo swallowed hard, fear clawing at his throat, and for the first time, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake coming here. The eerie familiarity of the inn gnawed at Ricardo as he moved deeper into the building. It wasn't just the yo-yo. Everything about this place seemed to awaken memories that had long been buried. He walked down the dimly lit hallway, his flashlight casting trembling shadows against the cracked walls. His footfalls echoed unnaturally, each step reverberating as if the hallway were an endless tunnel. There was something off about the way the sound carried, almost as if it was bouncing back from something unseen, something lurking just beyond the edges of the light. Ricardo stopped in front of an old door, its wood scarred and splintered with age. It bore no room number, just a strange symbol carved into the center. A spiral, like a vortex, surrounded by a series of jagged lines. The symbol tugged at something in the back of his mind, a memory blurred and out of reach. Without fully understanding why, Ricardo felt compelled to open the door. It was as if something on the other side was waiting for him, something that had been waiting for years. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a small room filled with dust and decay. The air was suffocating, thick with the scent of mold and something else, a metallic tang that reminded him of blood. On the floor, he noticed something partially hidden beneath an old sheet. He knelt down, lifting the fabric, and froze. It was an old leather-bound journal, the cover cracked and worn. He recognized it instantly. It was his grandfather's, a journal he hadn't seen since he was a boy, after his grandfather mysteriously vanished during a mountain hike. His parents had told him it was lost, and Ricardo had eventually let go of the memory. But seeing it here, in this place, made his skin crawl. He opened the journal, his hands trembling. The pages were filled with sketches of the mountains, detailed maps of the trails, and strange symbols that resembled the one carved into the door. His grandfather had been here. That much was clear. But the more he flipped through the pages, the darker the sketches became. Images of shadowy figures, twisted faces, and distorted reflections covered the latter pages, each more unsettling than the last. Ricardo's eyes locked on a specific drawing, a crude representation of the inn, with silhouettes standing at every window, their eyes black and hollow, watching. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness hit him. The room seemed to sway, and the air thickened further, making it hard to breathe. Ricardo stumbled back, gripping the edge of a dusty table to steady himself. The journal fell from his hands, landing open on a page with a single phrase scrawled repeatedly. "The mountain takes what it wants." He felt a chill run down his spine, and a voice, barely a whisper, echoed in his mind, repeating the words over and over. It was his grandfather's voice, filled with desperation and fear. Ricardo's flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering in and out, and for a brief moment, the shadows in the room seemed to move. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but what he saw made his blood run cold. In the corner of the room, a figure stood, tall and thin, its features obscured by darkness. It was watching him, its head tilted slightly, as if curious. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest, and he could barely breathe as the figure slowly raised one hand, pointing directly at him. The whisper in his mind grew louder, more insistent, until it was a deafening roar. Ricardo backed out of the room, slamming the door shut, his pulse racing. He stumbled down the hallway, the journal's words echoing in his ears. It was clear now. This place wasn't just familiar. It was connected to his past, to the unanswered questions about his grandfather's disappearance. The inn held secrets that should have stayed forgotten, and somehow it had drawn him here, as if to finish what his grandfather had started. But what frightened Ricardo the most was the realization that he might share the same fate, that the mountain had chosen him as its next victim. Ricardo's footsteps echoed through the narrow hallway as he moved away from the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could still feel the figure's gaze, even though he had shut the door. The inn was alive with a presence that felt malevolent, as though it took pleasure in his fear. The flickering light from his flashlight cast erratic, shifting shadows, making it seem like the walls themselves were closing in on him. As Ricardo continued down the hallway, he felt a strange pull. Something was drawing him toward a door at the end, one that seemed older, heavier than the others. When he reached the door, Ricardo hesitated, his instincts screaming for him to turn back. But something within him, a deep and terrible curiosity, pushed him to open it. The door creaked loudly, revealing a room bathed in a dim, sickly green light. In the center of the room was an old, full-length mirror, its glass cracked and foggy. Beside the mirror, a small girl stood, her back to him, her frame almost blending into the gloom. She wore a white dress stained with dirt, her hair tangled and dark. Ricardo swallowed, feeling his throat tighten. The girl didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, but somehow he knew she was aware of his presence. He stepped into the room, and the door swung shut behind him with a loud bang, making him jump. The girl finally turned, and Ricardo's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck in the light, and her lips moved soundlessly, as if she were speaking but couldn't produce the words. She raised a trembling hand, pointing at the mirror, and Ricardo followed her gesture, his eyes fixing on the reflection. In the cracked glass, he saw himself, but it wasn't quite him. The reflection showed Ricardo standing in a dark forest, the trees behind him twisted and warped, their branches reaching out like claws. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and wide with terror. The scene shifted, and Ricardo saw himself running through the woods, something chasing him, its shadow stretching out across the ground like a creeping stain. He could feel the fear of his reflection as if it were his own, the sheer panic of knowing there was no escape. The girl moved closer to him, her hollow eyes locking onto his. A voice echoed in Ricardo's mind, not his own, but distant cold, whispering words that made his skin crawl. To leave this place, you must choose. He looked at the girl, and she pointed again, this time at the floor. There, beside his feet, lay a small, framed photograph, half buried in dust. Ricardo knelt down, picking it up with trembling hands. It was a picture of him with his grandparents, taken when he was just a child, at their old country house. The memory of that time was one of warmth and safety, a feeling that seemed so distant now. The voice returned, more insistent this time. To save her, you must sacrifice your past. Ricardo looked at the girl, then back at the photograph. He understood now. The inn was demanding something from him, something precious. If he destroyed the photograph, if he let go of that cherished memory, he might be able to save the girl, to free her from whatever malevolent force held her here. But if he refused, if he kept the memory, she would remain trapped, and the whispers in the inn would surely haunt him forever. Ricardo's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. The photograph seemed to pulse in his hands, the edges growing warmer as if alive. He could almost hear the laughter of his grandparents, the smell of his grandmother's cooking, the sound of the old radio playing in background. Letting go of this memory would mean losing a piece of himself, a part of his identity that he could never recover. But the girl, she was so small, so fragile, and the emptiness in her eyes tore at his heart. The room seemed to darken, the green light fading to a sickly black as the shadows crept closer. The mirror showed his reflection again, this time surrounded by the dark figures that had chased him in the forest. They loomed over him, their hands reaching for him, their faces twisted in malicious grins. Ricardo knew he had to decide, and he had to do it now. His fingers tightened around the photograph, the edges crumpling beneath his grip. He could feel the eyes of the girl on him, her empty gaze filled with a silent plea. With a trembling breath, Ricardo made his choice. He closed his eyes, the weight of the decision crushing him, and in one swift motion, he tore the photograph in half. A cold wind swept through the room, and he heard the girl's voice for the first time, a soft, relieved whisper. "Thank you." When he opened his eyes, the girl was gone, and the mirror had shattered, the pieces lying scattered across the floor like shards of ice. The room was empty now, the oppressive presence lifted, but Ricardo felt a hollow ache in his chest, a sense of loss that he knew would never leave him. The door creaked open behind him, revealing the hallway once more, but Ricardo hesitated. He had saved the girl, but at what cost? The memory was fading already, slipping through his mind like sand through his fingers. He could barely remember his grandmother's face, the warmth of his grandfather's smile. The inn had taken something from him, something it had no right to claim, and he knew deep down that it wasn't finished with him yet. The door closed behind Ricardo with a soft click, and he was left alone in the dim hallway once more. The air was thick, almost stifling, as though the walls were closing in on him. Every breath he took seemed to resonate through the corridor, the silence amplifying even the smallest sound. Then felt more alive now, Not just a structure of wood and stone, but something sentient, something that watched and waited. Ricardo felt a shiver run down his spine, the sensation of unseen eyes tracking his every movement. The shadows around him seemed to throb, like they were breathing, growing darker and deeper with each flicker of his flashlight. As Ricardo moved forward, he became aware of a soft whisper, barely audible, emanating from the walls. It was faint, like the murmur of a distant conversation, just out of reach. He paused, turning his head to try and locate the source, but the whisper was elusive, slipping away whenever he focused on it. A chill settled in his bones as he strained to hear, the words blending together in a language he couldn't understand, a language that seemed ancient, filled with malice and secrets not meant for human ears. Suddenly, the hallway shifted. The shadows began to move, pooling together at the corners, slithering along the ceiling and creeping toward him. Ricardo's pulse quickened, and he shined his flashlight toward them, but the light seemed to falter, swallowed by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and he could feel the sound reverberating through his skull, a chorus of voices speaking in harmony, urging him to come closer, to give in to the darkness. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the whispers were relentless, worming their way into his mind. The hallway stretched on, longer than it had any right to be. Ricardo realized he was walking in circles. Every door he passed looked identical, and the numbers were all wrong, out of order, shifting as he moved. He reached out to touch the wall, his fingers brushing against the old, peeling wallpaper, and recoiled. The surface felt damp, almost organic, like the skin of some enormous creature. The feeling of dread intensified, the sense that the inn itself was alive, breathing around him, feeding off his fear. The whisper in the shadows became a voice, clearer now, and unmistakably his grandfather's. It called out to him, echoing down the hallway. "Ricardo, you must listen, you must follow." Ricardo's heart pounded, and his breath came in short, sharp gasps. He hadn't heard his grandfather's voice in years, but here it was, distorted and laced with something sinister. He wanted to run, to flee this place, but something inside him, a deep need for answers, kept his feet rooted to the floor. He had to know why his grandfather had vanished, what connection this inn had to him. Ricardo took a hesitant step forward, following the voice. It led him down a twisting corridor, the walls narrowing as he went, until he felt like he could barely breathe. The shadows grew thicker, pressing in from all sides, and the air reeked of decay and mildew, an oppressive stench that made his stomach churn. At the end of the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar, light spilling out in thin, wavering lines. The voice came again, this time more urgent. "In here, Ricardo. It's the only way." He pushed the door open, his hand trembling. The room beyond was small, filled with strange, antique furniture that seemed out of place, as if gathered from different eras. The walls were lined with mirrors, dozens of them, their surfaces cracked, reflecting distorted versions of the room. In each reflection, Ricardo saw something different. A child crying in the corner, an old man with hollow eyes staring back, his face a mask of despair, and a shadowy figure standing just behind him, its hand resting on his shoulder. Ricardo felt his throat tighten, fear clawing at him as he stepped into the room. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening, and they seemed to come from the mirrors themselves, as though each broken shard held a voice. The shadows moved behind the glass, shifting and writhing, and Ricardo realized with growing horror that they were watching him, their empty eyes locked onto his. One of the mirrors caught his attention, a tall, ornate piece with a gold frame, its glass dark and rippling like water. He felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a compulsion he could not resist. As he approached, the surface of the mirror changed. The darkness swirled, forming an image, the reflection of the hallway he had just come from, but something was wrong. The walls were lined with figures, their faces obscured, their bodies nothing more than vague silhouettes. They stood motionless, facing the mirror, and Ricardo realized they were waiting for him. He turned to look behind him, But the hallway was empty, only the flickering light of his flashlight illuminating the oppressive darkness. A sense of dread unlike anything he had ever felt gripped him. The whisper in his mind grew louder, almost a scream, urging him to step through, to join the figures in the reflection. Ricardo shook his head, backing away, his heart pounding. But the mirror seemed to reach out to him, the shadows within extending tendrils of darkness, wrapping around his wrists, pulling him closer. He struggled, his feet sliding across the floor, the cold touch of the shadows numbing his skin. Ricardo closed his eyes, fighting against the pull, and suddenly, the whispers stopped. Silence filled the room, and the darkness receded. He opened his eyes to find himself standing alone, the mirror shattered, shards covering the floor, each piece reflecting his terrified expression. The door behind him creaked open, and Ricardo turned to see the hallway again. But it was different now, narrower, darker, the walls seeming to close in, pulsating as though alive. He knew he had to keep moving, that whatever force haunted this inn was not finished with him. The whispers may have stopped for now, but the shadows remained, watching, waiting for their moment to strike again. Ricardo took a deep breath. Stepping out of the room, the crunch of broken glass underfoot the only sound in the oppressive silence. The inn was testing him, pushing him to his limits, and he could feel it. A presence, something ancient and hungry, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The hallway twisted in impossible ways as Ricardo moved deeper into the inn, the shadows around him growing thicker, pressing against the edges of his vision. The air was heavy, and each breath felt like he was inhaling something old, stagnant, as though every whisper of terror that had ever been breathed within these walls had lingered, accumulating over time. His flashlight flickered, its beam dimming as if it, too, was being drained by the darkness. Ricardo could feel his fear growing, a gnawing sensation that tightened his chest and whispered of hopelessness, of never escaping. The inn seemed to be shifting, the walls contracting and expanding like lungs, each movement accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible groan. The voices returned, not in whispers, but in faint echoes, slipping into his ears from all directions. This time, they were different. They were his own fears, his deepest insecurities spoken aloud, each word dripping with malice. "You'll never leave," they taunted. "You were always destined to be lost just like him." He tried to block out the words, but they sank in, wrapping around his mind like creeping vines, dragging him down into the abyss of his doubts. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a larger room, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, their shapes twisted and strange under the thin fabric, resembling shrouded figures frozen in time. Ricardo hesitated, his eyes scanning the room for any movement, his senses on high alert. The air was frigid, and his breath came out in short, visible puffs. He could feel something watching him, just out of sight, lurking within the folds of darkness. His gaze was drawn to an old, ornate chair positioned in the center of the room. Something lay draped across it, a heavy black cloak, its fabric shimmering slightly, as if it were woven from shadows. The whispers urged him forward, and Ricardo felt an inexplicable compulsion to reach out and touch the cloak. It seemed to pulse, to breathe, calling to him in a voice that was almost comforting, promising relief from the fear that gnawed at him. He approached the chair, his hand trembling as he extended it toward the fabric. The moment his fingers brushed the cloak, a wave of cold washed over him, and the room changed. The flickering bulb went out, plunging him into darkness, and the air grew impossibly heavy. Ricardo stumbled back, his heart pounding, as the shadows around him began to move, shifting and coiling. The figures beneath the sheets rose, the fabric sliding away to reveal twisted, distorted versions of himself. Each one had his face, but their expressions were wrong. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths twisted into cruel, mocking smiles. The figures spoke in unison, their voices echoing in the darkness. "You cannot escape what you are. You cannot run from your own fear. Ricardo felt a surge of panic, his pulse racing as he backed away, his flashlight shaking in his grip. He pointed it at the figures, but the beam did nothing to dispel them. It only illuminated their grotesque forms, the emptiness in their eyes that seemed to see straight through him. He could feel the darkness pressing in, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud, and the temptation to give in, to let go of his fear and surrender to the void, was almost overwhelming. His vision blurred, and Ricardo felt his knees weaken. The voices grew louder, more insistent, whispering of his failures, his regrets, the moments in his life where he had let people down, where he had failed to be enough. He saw his grandfather's face, distorted and twisted in pain, accusing him for not coming sooner, for not understanding the warnings. "You should have known," the voices hissed. "You should have listened." The shadows seemed to tighten around him, and Ricardo could feel his mind slipping, his will crumbling under the weight of the fear that surrounded him. But then, amidst the cacophony of voices, he heard something else, a faint melody, a tune that was oddly familiar. It was the song his grandmother used to hum, a lullaby that had comforted him as a child. Ricardo closed his eyes, focusing on the memory, the warmth of her presence, the softness of her voice. He could almost feel her hand on his shoulder, reassuring him, telling him that everything would be all right. The figures in the darkness wavered, their forms flickering as if they were struggling to maintain their shape. Ricardo took a deep breath, the melody growing stronger in his mind, pushing back against the shadows. He opened his eyes, and the figures began to fade, their hollow eyes losing focus, their twisted smiles faltering. The darkness loosened its grip, retreating, and the room seemed to expand, the air growing lighter. The bulb above flickered back to life, casting a dim glow across the room, and the shadows receded to the corners, leaving Ricardo standing alone once more. The cloak on the chair was gone, replaced by an old, faded photograph. A picture of his grandparents standing in front of a cabin, their smiles genuine and full of life. Ricardo picked it up, his hands steady now, and he felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of resolve. The inn was trying to break him, to use his fears against him, but he would not let it win. He folded the photograph carefully, placing it in his pocket, and turned back toward the hallway. The whispers had not stopped, but they were quieter now, more distant. Ricardo knew the inn was still watching, still waiting for him to falter, but he also knew he had the strength to fight back. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, but it no longer controlled him. He took a deep breath, the air still cold, but no longer suffocating, and stepped forward, determined to find the truth behind the shadows, to uncover the secrets that had claimed his grandfather and so many others before him. The inn might be filled with darkness, but Ricardo was no longer afraid to face it. Ricardo felt an ominous sense of purpose as he moved deeper into the heart of the inn, the photograph of his grandparents warm in his pocket, a reminder of what was at stake. The whispers had subsided into a haunting murmur, an ever-present hum that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The corridors twisted and turned, each passage leading him further away from any sense of direction, as if the inn had no real layout, but changed to suit the whims of something dark and malevolent. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of anticipation, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to strike. At last, Ricardo came to a door that was unlike the others. It was larger, its wood dark and gnarled, etched with the same strange spirals and symbols that he had seen earlier in his grandfather's journal. The carvings seemed to writhe under his gaze, shifting as though alive. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He knew deep down that whatever lay beyond this door held the answers he had been seeking. It was the heart of the inn, the place where everything converged, and it was calling to him. With a deep breath, Ricardo turned the knob, and the door swung open silently, revealing a room bathed in a dim, flickering red light. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with objects that seemed out of place. Old photographs, worn-out shoes, pieces of clothing, toys. They were relics of lives lost, pieces of those who had come before, now trapped within the inn's embrace. In the center of the room stood an altar, and above it, suspended by chains, hung a large, cracked mirror, its surface dark and rippling like the surface of a stormy sea. As Ricardo stepped into the room, he felt the air change, a coldness that seeped into his bones, a presence that filled the space, suffocating in its intensity. The door closed behind him with a finality that made his heart skip a beat. He knew there was no turning back. The mirror seemed to pulse, the chains creaking as it swayed gently, and Ricardo saw his reflection, twisted, gaunt, his face pale and hollow, as if the mirror was showing him the version of himself that was slowly being consumed by the inn. The shadows in the room began to shift, pooling on the floor and rising, taking form. Ricardo watched in horror as a figure emerged from the darkness, tall and skeletal, its face obscured beneath a hood of shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, two pinpoints of crimson light that bore into Ricardo's soul. The figure raised a hand, and the whispers in the room grew louder, more insistent, each voice overlapping the next, creating a cacophony that made Ricardo's head throb. The figure spoke, its voice a low, resonant growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You seek the truth, but the truth has a price," it intoned, each word vibrating through the room, shaking the very walls. Ricardo's heart pounded, and he took a step forward, his eyes locked on the mirror. The reflection had changed. He now saw his grandfather, standing in the same room, his face twisted in fear, his eyes wide as the shadowy figure loomed over him. Ricardo could feel his grandfather's terror, could hear his ragged breaths as if they were his own. He knew that his grandfather had been here, had faced this same moment, and had failed. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, the cold seeping deeper into Ricardo's flesh. "The mountain takes what it is owed," it whispered, extending a long, bony hand. In its palm lay the photograph of his grandparents, the edges scorched, the image slowly fading. Ricardo understood then. The inn demanded sacrifice, a piece of himself, something irreplaceable. He had already given up one memory, but it had not been enough. The inn wanted more, and it would not let him go without taking something precious. Ricardo's gaze shifted to the mirror, where he saw his own reflection again, standing alone, lost and empty. The whispers swirled around him, urging him to give in, to let go of everything he held dear, to become a part of the darkness that filled the inn. The figure loomed over him, its hand outstretched, waiting for his decision. Ricardo's mind raced, fear clawing at him. But he knew he couldn't give in. He had to fight, had to find another way, had to break the cycle that had claimed his grandfather and so many others before him. With a surge of determination, Ricardo reached into his pocket, pulling out the photograph. The warmth of it gave him strength, and he held it up to the mirror. "You will not take this from me," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. The figure hissed, the room growing colder, the chains suspending the mirror rattling violently. Ricardo could feel the shadows closing in, the presence of the inn pressing down on him, trying to force him to submit. But he refused, focusing all his will on the memory of his grandparents, on the love and warmth they had given him. Suddenly, the mirror shattered, the glass exploding outward in a shower of shards that glittered like dark stars. The shadowy figure let out a howl, a sound of rage and pain that reverberated through the room, shaking the walls. The shadows recoiled, retreating to the corners of the room, and the oppressive cold began to lift. Ricardo stood, breathing heavily, his heart pounding, as the fragments of the mirror lay scattered at his feet. The figure was gone, its presence dissipated, and the whispers had fallen silent. The room seemed to breathe, the tension easing, and Ricardo felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He looked down at the photograph, now whole and untouched, the faces of his grandparents smiling back at him. He knew he had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but he also knew that the battle was far from over. The inn had tested him, had tried to break him, but he had held on to what mattered most, his love, his memories, his sense of self. The door behind him creaked open, revealing the hallway once more, the darkness less oppressive, the air lighter. Ricardo turned, stepping out of the room, the photograph still clutched in his hand. He had faced the truth, had confronted the darkness within himself, and though he had emerged changed, he was not broken. The inn had tried to consume him, but he had fought back, and he knew now that he had the strength to see this through, to uncover the secrets that lay hidden in the shadows, and to find a way out of this nightmare. The hallway stretched endlessly before Ricardo, yet the air had shifted. There was a heaviness that whispered of something final. He knew that whatever was left to face, it would be waiting for him at the end of this path. The inn seemed to breathe around him, the walls pulsing with a sinister, rhythmic beat, as if alive. Each step Ricardo took felt like a challenge, daring him to press on despite the dread coiling in his gut. The photograph of his grandparents lay against his chest, a talisman of hope, but it felt fragile in the face of what was to come. At the end of the hallway, a set of large double doors stood closed. They were dark and polished, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and twist as Ricardo approached. He reached out, his hand trembling, and as his fingers made contact, the doors swung open of their own accord. A cold wind rushed out, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers, anguished voices that spoke of loss, of broken promises, and of souls forever bound to this place. Ricardo stepped through, his heart pounding, knowing there was no turning back now. The room beyond was vast, impossibly so, its dimensions defying the confines of the inn. It was filled with shadows, shapes that moved and twisted, forming walls, arches, and pathways that led in all directions. At the center of the room was a stone platform, and on it stood the figure Ricardo had seen before, tall, skeletal, draped in darkness. Its hood was pulled low, hiding its features, but its eyes glowed beneath, twin points of malevolent crimson that pierced through the darkness. It turned to face Ricardo, and for the first time, it spoke directly to him, its voice resonating like a drumbeat within his mind. You return, bearing the memory of the lost, but you cannot save what has already been taken, the figure intoned, its voice a blend of anger and sorrow. The air grew colder, and Ricardo could feel his strength draining, the chills seeping into his very bones. He took a step forward, refusing to be cowed, his eyes locked on the figure. The photograph burned against his chest, filling him with warmth that pushed back against the cold. You're wrong, Ricardo said, his voice trembling but resolute. I won't let you take anything more. I will not be part of your darkness. The figure let out a low, echoing laugh, and the shadows in the room surged forward, surrounding Ricardo, forming a vortex that twisted around him, pulling at his mind, his body, trying to tear him apart. The whispers grew louder, becoming screams, each one filled with torment and agony, each voice pleading for release. Ricardo gritted his teeth, holding his ground as the shadows pushed and pulled at him, his eyes fixed on the figure that stood at the center of it all. It raised one bony hand, and the shadows twisted tighter, a suffocating shroud that sought to drown him in darkness. Suddenly, the photograph in Ricardo's hand began to glow, a soft light that cut through the shadows, pushing them back. The warmth spread through him, a sensation of love, of family, of everything that made him who he was. He knew this was the key. This was how he could fight back against the darkness. Ricardo took a deep breath and stepped forward, raising the photograph high, the light growing brighter, pushing back the shadows that writhed around him. The figure let out a roar of fury, the room shaking with the force of it, but Ricardo did not falter. He moved closer, each step an act of defiance, each step pushing back against the fear that had held him for so long. The shadows shrank away, the whispers turning to desperate pleas, and Ricardo felt the weight of the souls trapped in this place, their pain, their loss. He knew he had to set them free, had to end the cycle of darkness that the inn fed upon. As he reached the stone platform, the figure lashed out, its hand striking toward Ricardo, but the light of the photograph flared, blinding in its intensity. The figure recoiled, its form unraveling, the darkness peeling away to reveal what lay beneath. A twisted, hollow shell, an echo of all the fear and suffering that had been consumed by the inn. Ricardo held the photograph closer to the figure, the light searing away the shadows until nothing remained but a frail, skeletal figure, its eyes wide with terror. "You cannot end this. You are but one, and the mountain is eternal," the figure hissed, its voice weak, filled with desperation. Ricardo shook his head. "I'm not alone. They are with me," he said, his voice growing stronger. The faces of those who had been lost filled his mind. His grandfather, the girl, the others who had wandered into the inn and never returned. He could feel their presence, their hope, their need to be free. And with one final surge of strength, Ricardo pressed the photograph against the figure's chest. The light exploded outward, filling the room, and the shadows screamed, their forms dissolving, unraveling into nothingness. The room shook, the walls cracking, the ceiling splintering as the darkness was driven away. The figure let out one final wail, its form disintegrating, blown away like ash in the wind. Ricardo fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The photograph now nothing but a faint glow in his hand. The room began to fade, the walls crumbling, the stone platform shattering, and Ricardo knew that the inn was collapsing, the darkness that had held it together no longer able to sustain it. He pushed himself to his feet, the warmth of the photograph guiding him, and he turned, stumbling back toward the door. The air was filled with light now, the shadows gone, and he could feel the presence of those who had been lost, their spirits finally free, their whispers no longer filled with pain but with gratitude. Ricardo reached the hallway, the doors slamming shut behind him as the room beyond disintegrated into nothingness. The inn was falling apart, the walls shaking, the floor buckling beneath his feet. He ran, the light of the photograph leading him, guiding him through the twisting corridors, past the rooms filled with memories, the weight of the inn's darkness lifting with each step. He burst through the front doors, out into the cold night air, the wind rushing past him, carrying with it the final whispers of the souls that had been freed. The inn behind him collapsed, the walls crumbling, the roof caving in, until nothing remained but a pile of rubble, the darkness finally vanquished. Ricardo fell to the ground, his heart pounding, his body aching, but a sense of peace washing over him. He looked at the photograph, now faded, the faces of his grandparents smiling back at him, and he knew that he had done what he had set out to do. The mountain had tried to take him, but he had fought back, and he had won. Ricardo stood amidst the wreckage of the inn, the cold mountain air filling his lungs, each breath sharp and bracing. The once imposing structure had been reduced to rubble, and yet an eerie silence lingered over the ruins. The weight of what he had endured still pressed on his mind. Every step, every whisper, every dark temptation had left a scar. Though he had triumphed over the entity, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left undone, that the mountain still held onto a part of him, watching from the shadows. The light of dawn began to peek over the distant peaks, casting long shadows across the mountainside. Ricardo slowly rose to his feet, his body aching, every muscle screaming in protest. He took a deep breath, the chill filling him with a strange mix of relief and trepidation. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the photograph of his grandparents. The image had grown faint, the edges blurred, as though the light had burned away parts of it. He studied their faces, trying to remember every detail, but the memories seemed distant now, like a dream fading in the morning light. Ricardo turned his gaze back to the pile of rubble that had once been the inn. It looked ordinary now, just a crumbling old ruin, its sinister presence gone. But as his eyes traced the jagged stones and splintered wood, a shiver ran down his spine. He could still feel something, a presence that lingered, hidden just beneath the surface. The whispers had stopped, but the silence felt heavy, as though the inn's malevolent spirit had not been completely banished. Ricardo knew better than to think it was truly over. The mountain had taken countless souls, and perhaps it still hungered for more. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye. At the far edge of the ruins, partially obscured by debris, he saw a figure. It was fleeting, barely there, a shadow that seemed to shift and blend into the early morning mist. Ricardo's heart skipped a beat, and he blinked, but the figure was gone. His pulse quickened, and he scanned the area, searching for any sign of what he had seen. The air seemed to grow colder, the chills seeping into his bones, and a familiar feeling crept over him, a sense of being watched, of unseen eyes following his every move. Ricardo took a cautious step forward, his gaze locked on the spot where the figure had appeared. His foot crunched against the gravel, and for a moment, the sound echoed strangely, as though the mountain itself was repeating it back to him. He felt a knot of dread tightening in his chest, the uneasy realization that the shadows had not truly let him go. The inn may have crumbled, but its influence stretched further than its walls, deeper into the heart of the mountain, woven into its very essence. Ricardo wondered if the darkness was bound to this place, or if it was something that could follow him, something that could haunt him forever. The wind picked up, a low howl that seemed to carry a faint echo of the whispers he had heard inside the inn. It called his name, the sound so soft he almost believed he imagined it. Ricardo's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. He clutched the photograph tightly, as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. He turned away from the ruins, his steps deliberate, each movement a struggle to pull himself from the pull of the mountain's hold. He had survived, but he couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him was still trapped there, bound to the dark secrets of the Shadowy Mountains. Ricardo made his way down the narrow path that led away from the inn, the morning light slowly spreading across the mountainside. He could feel the weight of the memories pressing down on him, each step a reminder of what he had faced, of the darkness that had tried to claim him. He glanced back once, his eyes scanning the ruins, and for a brief moment, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a face, pale and hollow, peering out from beneath the rubble, its eyes empty, watching him leave. It was gone in an instant, swallowed by the shadows, but Ricardo knew it had been real. The realization settled heavily in his chest. The mountain was not done with him. It never would be. He had faced the darkness and survived, but the inn's malevolence was something that could not be destroyed so easily. It lingered, a presence that was patient, waiting for the right moment to reach out again. Ricardo turned his gaze back to the path ahead, forcing himself to move forward, each step taking him further from the ruins, but never truly away from the fear that had taken root within him. As the sun rose higher, the shadows began to recede, but they never fully disappeared. They clung to the edges of the trees, pooled in the cracks of the rocks, always present, always waiting. Ricardo knew that he could never truly escape them. The mountain had claimed a part of him, and he would carry it with him forever. A reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the light, a darkness that could never be fully banished. He reached the base of the mountain, the village coming into view in the distance. The sight of it filled him with a fleeting sense of relief, a reminder of the world beyond the nightmare he had endured. But as he approached, the wind carried a sound that made him pause, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from the mountain itself. It called his name, a soft, lingering echo that promised the terror was not over, that the inn's grasp extended far beyond its crumbling walls. Ricardo clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he looked back up at the towering peaks of the Shadowy Mountains. He would leave this place, but he knew that the shadows would follow. The mountain had its secrets, and now he was one of them. He turned back to the village, his steps slow and deliberate, the weight of the darkness still heavy on his shoulders, a reminder that some battles are never truly over, and some places never truly let you go.